I'm Phil Mason. I'm the head of regulatory engagement with Trustmark. Until about 3 years ago, I was head of compliance with Trustmark. So I have been in a technical capacity, but I'm no longer. For the simple reason that my role has changed insofar that I started to sort of build relationships with government, with our government department, the devolved nations, which is really quite an interesting activity, with Ofgem, and certainly the sort of I suppose I'd say high level sort of stakeholders in the industry that need to participate in Trustmark because of their deliveries through the funded scheme, through the government capital funded schemes, and through ECO. So I'm going to take you through Trustmark, take you on a bit of a journey. So what is Trustmark is one of the sort of conversations, because a lot of people say, well, how did Trustmark come into being, and why have you got the responsibility that you have, or that we've been given? Our relationship with PAS 2035, a little bit about the data warehouse. That's quite a high level about how the data warehouse operates, and the expectations of its use, and then very briefly a bit about the Trustmark quality assurance process, because effectively what Trustmark is an assurance scheme, for a number of reasons, and some of which I'll start to talk about. So Trustmark is the only government endorsed quality scheme, and there's a reason that we're here. We've been around since 2005, and originally we were set up through sort of government and through consumer protection organisations, or at the request of consumer protection organisations in government, in order to be able to deliver quality for things that people have done in their home. So Trustmark's a pretty broad church. I know probably most of our interests this afternoon will be around energy efficiency, but we're a broad church covering the vast majority of trades. I think somewhere in the region of about 150 trades or works that people would have carrying out in their home. So we're not for profit social enterprise, and what that actually means is we are able to invest. We have to be sustainable in order to continue our existence, but we don't feed shareholders. We're not one of those type of organizations. Not that there's anything wrong with that type of organization. So anything that we do create beyond our operational needs goes back into the scheme for continuous improvement. And Trustmark has moved quite a long way in the 6 years that I've worked for them, in terms of the additional compliance functions that we produce, that we deliver, I should say, and the way that the data warehouse has developed, which has not quite got a life of its own because it's controlled, but it's changed considerably over the last certainly 2 or 3 years. And I'd like to say it's become a little bit more user-friendly as well. It was quite a complex process about uploading documents, and of course the data warehouse through energy efficiency is mapped back to PAS 2035, so we don't really have too much discretion about what it needs to do, because PAS 2035 is PAS 2035, and there is a bit of detail behind that, but I think the process of being able to use it has hopefully become a little bit more user friendly. Okay, so people don't register with Trustmark directly. We work through scheme providers. I think that figure's slightly out of date. I think that's nearer 40 schemes than 37, and it's on the up. So the reason is because we register trades through such broad areas. Trustmark was never established in a way that people would register directly with us. It would always be through their scheme provider. So when we talk about scheme providers, those could be any reputable organisation that meets the Trustmark framework operating requirements, and I'll speak a little bit about that in a few minutes, that can meet the requirements for vetting tradespeople, and carrying out a professional function that meets the requirement. And so our scheme providers, it's quite broad as well, because it can be anybody from a trade association, a reputable trade association that sets standards for its trades, right the way through to PAS 2030 certification bodies. And they're all expected to meet the framework operating requirements, but they meet it in different ways, because a trade association is a voluntary organisation, as we all know, that comes into being because it wants to represent its sector. And then the PAS 2030 certification bodies work under the UCAS accreditation requirements, and their membership is, I would say, probably 99% inclusive of businesses that have to be past 2030 certificated because of the roles that they function under the funded scheme. So it's quite broad. So let me just, yeah, that is an interesting figure. Let me just talk about that a bit. We have around 15,000 registered businesses, which on its own doesn't sound like an enormous number, but actually, if you look at the supply chains that sit beneath those businesses, because we register organisations at business level, we believe, and this is it, and that number may have gone up as well in discussion and relationship we have with the CITB, that beneath those 15,000 businesses, we believe or understand through an evidence-based understanding that there's around 50,000 tradespeople and subcontractors that sit under those 15,000 businesses. So it's quite a large membership base, really, if you think about the individuals involved, and that continues to grow. Now, we want it to grow and we need it to grow for the simple reason that the supply chains under the funded schemes, as some of you will already have experience of, is not as large as we'd like it to be. It's not uncommon to get into a conversation with people that have government funding that say, they come and speak directly to us when we go to public events and say, look, Trustmark, or look, Phil, we've got X amount of £1 million that we want to spend over a duration, and our supply chain is only just able to deliver that. So we need to continue our activities to promote and grow the supply chain. And the construction industry in general is probably struggling a little bit from supply chain pressures, even though the fact we're in a sort of cost of living crisis, the construction industry is still exceedingly busy, and they don't necessarily feel the inclination to engage with past 2035 and past 2030 through the funded schemes. And that's where we do quite a lot of work, because we need, I don't know if you could ever set an upper limit on it, but we want more engagement so that the government can invest more money, and more money can be spent on improving dwellings around the country. So just very briefly, some of you will be very familiar with the Each Home Counts review. It's a few years old now. It's published in 2016, and the Each Home Counts review made 27 recommendations, one of which for a quality mark, which was awarded to Trustmark after the implementation board of EHC interviewed a number of organisations that were sort of well placed with government to be able to deliver a quality mark, and Trustmark ended up being that organisation. And there was a recommendation that it should be run jointly between Trustmark and MCS. And the folks that we've got to know very well at MCS will probably be in the same sort of view as I am, that the relationship wasn't perhaps what it could have been back in 2016, but that relationship has changed dramatically over the last few years. And we're working with MCS to remove any of the sort of duplications that exist between the two schemes and be able to work more closely for the benefit of industry. So that's a little bit of a watch this space type comment, because we're not at the end of that journey yet, and we're not quite at the point of announcing sort of the outputs of it. But what we're trying to do is just work very closely so that people that have a requirement to be MCS and Trustmark can do something in a more straightforward format. So as we go through the years, up on the screen there was funding for the data warehouse, which came from what's now DESNES, but which was BASE at the time. And it was quite a simplistic process from its onset, in order that there was a lodgement process in place for Eco 3. And it was a little bit clunky, and that's developed considerably. And then Trustmark is become, what should we say, the custodians of the compliance function for past 2035. So we don't own or create past 2035. We have a seat on the British Standards Steering Group, but we are the custodians of the compliance process against it. We got a bit of a challenge, as we all have in industry at the moment. There's been a new past 2035 issued at the end of September. September just gone. 28th of September is what I was thinking of. And so we've got to remap our systems and our compliance processes to be able to deliver against the new version of past 2035, which has been, it's been streamlined a little bit to make it easy to engage with, because I don't think there's any secret about the fact that past 2035 is very well adopted under the government schemes and under the energy company obligation. But it's a wider process, and the intention is that it can be used for all retrofit, but out into the able to pay markets, the sort of owner occupier able to pay market engagement is a little bit limited, if indeed existent. So the engagement process with past 2035 needs to improve a little bit. Okay, what does Trustmark cover? Well, you can that's just an example of the things that we register trades for, and it goes back to what I said about it being a fairly sort of broad church. Interesting one: garden landscapers, tree surgeons, the National Association of Carpet Cleaners are part of our Trustmark scheme providers, as well as all the traditional trades that we would think more of, sort of directly and immediately, and into energy efficiency. And I think Trustmark's role has changed since 2018, since we were drafted into the eco regulations, and then there is the requirement under the rules of all the funded schemes, SHDF, what the Green Homes Grant at the time, and the Home Upgrade Grant. So we're in a number of sort of areas, which would appear that it's continuing to expand, as well as the government draw policy up about investing money into retrofit. Trustmark, how do we drive up quality against the home improvement sector? So I think one of the challenges that's been set is anybody can set themselves up with as a builder. You can buy a vehicle, you can brand it in whatever way you like, and you can become a builder, and you work to the building regulations, and you may or may not fall under the jurisdiction of inspection through competent person schemes, depending where your membership lies, and you may or may not fly under the radar of actually local authority building controls as well. So what we've been tasked with is becoming an organisation that the public can come to without understanding all the mechanisms and all the technical workings beneath it, but that if you use a Trustmark registered business, there is a process of someone being able to demonstrate their competence before they become Trustmark registered. Then there is an ongoing process of monitoring standards, and there's escalation processes where we find non-compliances. So really what we're about is more people getting it right for more of the time, first time. Now, things do go wrong periodically, and we have a complaints disputes process, which is fairly well practiced by now. We're not deluged with complaints. Initially, those would be directed towards the scheme provider that would manage what's happened between the consumer's expectation and what the tradesperson has delivered in their home. They tend to get managed out at sort of at business level, but they could be escalated up to the Trustmark scheme provider, and then in due course into Trustmark. So we don't investigate the complaint directly itself. That isn't our brief, but we work with the scheme provider to ensure that the consumer's concern or complaint is managed accordingly. So as I say, we're not deluged with complaints. I think in the main, because of the control mechanisms that are in place, much of the work is carried out in the way that it should be expected to in the first instance, because people are competent, they demonstrate their competency, and then they're managed through an ongoing process of measuring the standards that are delivered. And next really important part of what we do is our assurance function. Originally, when Trustmark was first created, the assurance function was delivered purely by scheme providers, but with the transfer of the energy company obligation, sort of eco-technical monitors it was called at the time, that came into us. We did it through a third-party organisation. We've now taken that in-house, and we have a substantial team of surveyors skilled in energy efficiency measures. And that brief will open up as we carry out more assurance across different areas. But we do direct quality assurance on the work that's carried out by Trustmark in registered businesses that's lodged into the data warehouse, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in some detail in just a few minutes. We have this thing called the data warehouse that I've mentioned, and what that enables us to do is take trends over what we see and how things are delivered against it, and from the data, it's the data warehouse lodgement process and the risk-based monitor algorithm that sits behind it that dictates where we go to perform quality assurance. And consumer protection is the primary reason that Trustmark is here, really, that businesses that are Trustmark registered have decent trading practices. It's not reinventing the wheel, it's just complying with what's already out there. We have a dispute resolution process that with escalations right up to a dispute resolution ombudsman, which becomes binding, and that's the final stage before anybody gets into the judicial process, which many people don't wish to do or haven't got the capability to enter into. So we manage those through the DRO, and financial protection for consumers. So what that means is all work that comes through Trustmark is protected as a minimum by 2 years financial protection. If they're the more complicated, complex measures that come through the funded schemes, such as external wall insulation or internal wall insulation or room in roof, that bears 25-year financial protection against it, which is quite substantial, really. We inherited the requirements from Ofgem under the old eco scheme, so we haven't designed it, but the duration stayed the same. We have a financial protection panel that approve policies to make sure they do what they say they'll do. So how does Trustmark work? I'll keep this simple. There's 3 licenses in play. We're licensed back to the Department of Business and Trade in Westminster Government, so they oversee what we do. We then license Trustmark scheme providers that come forward that can meet the standards. They're bound by something called the Framework Operating Requirements, which is an extensive set of governance requirements that they need to meet from the point of registering with Trustmark, and then we monitor them on a risk-based process, but normally once a year, to be sure that they're continuing to meet the standards that we set down to the scheme provider via the Framework Operating Requirements. So the Framework Operating Requirements are freely available on our website should anybody wish to go and pick them up and have a look through them. It's quite a lengthy document. In some respects, it probably needs a little bit of a streamline. I think we're up to version 2.6. I think the next version that we'll publish will be a complete revision, which will be version 3, and it will strengthen some areas and simplify others. It's not about reducing standards, it's just about making it more straightforward to engage with. And the scheme provider, as I say earlier, registers the all-important registered businesses. We call them registered businesses, but they're actually issued with a license. And it might be a more powerful term to use the phrase that's on the slide there about licensed businesses, because it conveys a different message. Registration is registration, licensing is something else. And then we have something called the Code of Conduct, which sits just beneath the Framework Operating Requirements, which are the behavioural attributes that we would expect a licensed business to display. And then there's something called the Customer Charter, which is a very simple public-facing document that explains what a consumer can expect when they engage with the Trustmark registered businesses. So 3 licenses: government to Trustmark, Trustmark to scheme providers to businesses, then the suite of documents that sit at each one of those stages that set out the governance requirements that we audit against. Right, now this is just a snapshot, and this as of a few weeks ago, this slide became slightly outdated, but I've left it exactly this for a very specific reason. If you look there at the schemes that Trustmark's mandated into the energy company obligation, the Great British Insulation Scheme, it's having a little bit of a slow start, but it is starting to pick up. The Home Upgrade Grant Phase 2, SHDF, and we've got SHDF Wave 2.2, which I think opens about now. I think a government website talks about mid-November, and I think we're actually bang on the midpoint of November, aren't you? Where I think there's something about an additional top of around 80 million pounds being invested. And so I'm guessing that's where some of your interests lie in order to be able to deliver against SHDF. And a much smaller scheme, the Warm Homes Discount Scheme, which is generally linked back to people that are struggling to heat their homes. And it's about boiler installations and boiler repairs. And typically, despite the fact we're moving towards sort of a new, more carbon neutral phase of the sort of evolution of our race and planet, really, that's still essentially around gas boilers. And that policy may change over time. So if it's not a calculation I've ever done, but if you look at all those monies that are listed against all those schemes, that's a tremendous amount of money being invested by government, and there needs to be an assurance mechanism to make sure that's delivered to the right quality. So our data warehouse, okay, parties that lodge into the data warehouse for the purposes of these conversations are normally always would be. We have other schemes where there are different people that lodge in different functions that lodge into the data warehouse, but for the sake of eco and the capital funded government schemes, it's the retrofit coordinator that lodges the work in compliance with PAS 2035 into the data warehouse. And then what we do is we analyze that data from a desktop perspective to make sure that there's a compliance standard being met. and then we drop that feeds a risk-based algorithm in order that we can then carry out on-site audit. And then what we do is we report back to Ofgem, we report back to our government department, DESNES, who did what, where and when. That's on a monthly basis. We report back to Ofgem for eco in terms of the compliance findings we get. We share data with UCAS that oversee the certification bodies. And then on a monthly basis, we report back to the PAS 2030 certification bodies to help them with their compliance function to make sure that they're getting their ratios right, because the Trustmark data warehouse lodgement process is linked to organisations actually getting paid. So it's a pretty true picture of the volume of work that's being carried out, and it just enables everybody to join their activities together. That those data sharing arrangements will probably grow over time with maybe other different parties. It might be DULUC that might have an interest in it that we could share information with, and we're interested in doing it for the greater good. Now, what we don't do is share people's private details. It's all within data compliance requirements, guidance and legislation, but we share quite a lot of aggregated data so that different organisations and different government departments get an understanding of what's happening. Well, support them in their understanding of what's happening. So our relationship with PAS 2035, as I say, we don't own PAS 2035. We don't create it. We're not the custodians of it. It's something that came out of the Each Home Counts review as a standard in order that we can go forward and retrofit the nation with a level of confidence and sort of risk mitigation. We've got 24 million homes to retrofit in the UK, and it's important that we don't get several million in and think, crikey, we're making a bit of a hash of this. So the process is there to mitigate risk in people's homes in order to make sure that energy efficiency measures are installed in the right sequence and to the right quality. Relatively new overarching. We've been calling it for years, actually, the new overarching retrofit standard, but it was created and published in 2019, so it's a few years old, and it's just going through a review. It's just been through a review, being a new document, PAS 2023, that was published on the 28th of September. So there's an 18-month transition that's been agreed between UCAS, between DESNES, between Ofgem and ourselves, in order to allow businesses that are working to the existing standard an 18-month period to transition to the new standard. The first 6 months of that standard transition will be the certification bodies preparing their case to be re-accredited to the new PAS 2030 standard by UCAS, and then the following 12 months will be where PAS 2030 certificated businesses go through the process over a 12-month period. They can bring their timescales forward if they want to move to the standard more quickly. And then on the 30th of March 2023, the existing standard will be withdrawn, and everybody will be over to the new standard. But I think something that's important to say, particularly around some SHDF projects, some of them will run beyond March 2023. So we're working with DESNES currently to work out exactly what the process is that those projects can continue to flow and that they don't get stranded. And if you think about the building regulations, there's a lot of property developers that are working to building regulations that are no longer in existence, but their projects started under a standard, so it's only reasonable that it should be completed under a standard. So there needs to be some reassurance about the fact that projects once they've started, don't have to be redesigned to the new standard. They continue to flow through. Bit on there about what the requirements are, and I'm guessing there's a level of familiarity around those. It's a standardized process really about dwelling assessment, then trying to take the assessment to try to understand what can be best done to that dwelling, because you can't install all retrofit energy efficiency measures in all dwellings. Some measures just aren't suitable to accept the measure. So that's about risk mitigation. The example would be cavity wall insulation on the west coast of Wales in high sort of wind-driven rain penetration areas. It results in wet cavities, and that's not an indictment or a criticism of the measure itself. It's about putting the right measure in the right dwelling. So there needs to be an options evaluation, then it goes into a plan. Professional design by qualified people, monitoring. of the outcomes of the projects to make sure that we haven't got unintended consequences. And a big element of it is advice to the householder about what is appropriate to that dwelling and where they should start their journey. And I think it's a well-tested process. So, as I say, it's been simplified a little bit. Past 2035 had 3 risk pathways in it, and the risk pathways have been removed. So there is only one process, but there are slightly different requirements for particular types of dwelling, which seems right because you can't just have a one size fits all. And that links back to each home counts, that every home is potentially completely different. And I think that seems to be bearing out the truth of the statement, really. Past 2035, that's the overarching standards. I think I may have said a couple of times, and it links out to other standards. They're just giving you 2 examples there. 5250, control of condensation in dwellings, which is important as we start to retrofit, because if you put an overcoat over a traditional building that reduces its breathability, you increase the risk of condensation and in turn black mold, which isn't good for well, anybody, but particularly people with respiratory issues. So there's a number of other documents are linked to, and it must be used in accordance with past 2035 certification, so that you've got the right level of process to be followed, but we've also got competent certificated installer businesses that have demonstrated their credentials to be able to install those measures correctly. And the retrofit coordinator has been quite a revolutionary sort of step, really. It's a new profession. It's been branded. We need somewhere in the to retrofit the entire nation. We need somewhere in the region of about 30,000 retrofit coordinators, and currently registered with Trustmark there are something less than 1,000. So we've still got some way to go. But the retrofit coordinators and retrofit assessors that fall beneath those roles are just about covering the funded works. But as policy drivers start to change to bring in the able to pay market in the private rental sector, those numbers need to grow very substantially. So there's a bit of a challenge in front of us all, really, to be perfectly honest. So past 2035 was created that it could be used in isolation. It doesn't have to be married with Trustmark. It's a process that sets out the steps that need to be done to manage risk in dwellings. If it's used in isolation and without Trustmark, past 2035 in itself doesn't provide the consumer protection and disputes process that Trustmark does. So that's why Trustmark complements it. The data warehouse lodgement is visibility of what's been done by whom, by when, and how under past 2035. So without Trustmark, that element wouldn't be there. And I think what's really important, and we get mixed results, is the independent audit of retrofit assessors and retrofit coordinators. There are some really, really competent, high quality assessors and coordinators come into practice over the last 3 or 4 years, but we still get people within our industry that see it perhaps as a bit of a gravy train, and they're people that we don't want within our supply chains because they're a weakness to the delivery. So that's why independent audit is particularly important. And I keep mentioning risk-based. We don't set a fixed percentage. We base it on results. If somebody's not doing too well, we look at them a bit more closely, and if needs be, we put them in pause. So just very briefly, the lodgement process. It's the retrofit coordinator that creates the lodgement, and what they do is they go into the retrofit portal and they open a retrofit project. All projects start with a retrofit assessment. That's the very beginning stage, and the retrofit assessor can lodge the assessment, or some retrofit coordinators are assessors as well, so they lodge their own assessment at the time of opening the project. We require an RD SAP XML data at the start of the process, and then we require that again at the end, so there's a measurement of the change of the dwelling. And there is key information that has to be commenced at project's lodgement commencement stage before a project ID can be created. And the project ID is, for those of you that work under certain schemes, some information will be asked back of the organizations that are administrating the schemes in order to know that lodgement has started, how far you are through a lodgement, and then a lodgement that's been completed. And there's just a a pictorial form of this in the slide afterwards, I think, that might make it, some of it, slightly clearer if you've not engaged with the data warehouse before. So defects in a property, they're very often understood and identified at assessment stage. They can be identified at the time of installation because the work started and there's a closer physical intervention in the property. So different defects can be noted at different stages, and the retrofit coordinator's got the functionality to be able to do that both from the assessment stage and as the project carries out. We need to know who the designer is and what measures they cover, because in a number of retrofit projects there are a number of designs because there's different skill sets for different measures. The projects can be completed at stages, which is important to support people with cash flow, because we've listened to what originally there was just one project and then one lodgement and it was completed. But as we've gone to whole house retrofit, and they're multi-measures, there's greater investment being made by the supply chain. So it seems only reasonable that we create a process that enables them to produce evidence of lodgement at stages, so stage payments can be made. And each of those lodge stages, they could be 2 or 3 measures, they could be a single measure, or it could all be lodged in one instance in a short project, or if somebody can withstand the cash flow issues associated with buying materials and carrying out whole house retrofit. And then at the end of it, as I've just said, we need an updated RD SAP XML lodged into the data warehouse. Probably a little bit clearer, this one, and I think in probably future iterations of this presentation, this might be the slide to focus on. The retrofit coordinator creates a draft project. If you can see those blue, I think the slides will be circulated after the event, so you've got something for reference. If any of the font is perhaps a little bit small, maybe for a team sort of conversation like this. To create the project, intended outcomes, what the project is intended to achieve, the improvement evaluation option evaluation, the medium-term improvement plan, risk assessment. So that risk assessment will come out because we're remapping the data warehouse to the new version of PAS 2035, and the risk assessment isn't there. So that's as it sits under the existing PAS 2035. The retrofit design and the PAS roles, which business is installing which measure. So all that goes in before the project actually gets through into progress. Then it becomes an in-progress stage. The retrofit coordinators lodges the measures. They can do those in stages, and at the end of it, then there's project completion. And that information at the other side is because retrofit coordinators require certain pieces of evidence to pass into their the people that are administrating the schemes they work within. There needs to be a staged process to be able to identify that various activities have been carried out and reference numbers are assigned. Because the data warehouse is mapped back to PAS 2035, it is quite an in-depth process, and we produce, I think it's maybe 7 supporting videos about how you can use the data warehouse. And if that doesn't work, and if there is still questions as a result of using those informative sort of educational type videos, that we build the FAQs, that continues to grow. And if that doesn't give you the answer you need, you pick up the phone and you can contact us as support, or you use the email facility on the website where you can send your question in, and we will do our best to respond to those. Sometimes that needs to get down into proper conversation because we get questions that we may not fully understand, and sometimes the written word is better verbally explained. So we've got a support department. Very briefly then, lodgement cost. To open a lodgement is £30. If you lodge at both stages of the project, it's a slightly less, it's a more inexpensive process because there's less functions behind it. But the reason there is a cost is that the lodgement fee is what funds the Trustmark quality assurance function. We're not funded by government. We don't get paid through any other mechanisms. We are funded by the industry as the quality mark for the industry, and that's why there's a fee for lodgement. Quality assurance process, just get to back down to this. Right, we do everything on a risk basis. There are some really, really reputable, competent businesses working to, I would say in some instances, some businesses that we come across actually exceed the required standard. So on the basis that we operate by risk, it's the businesses that perhaps leave a little bit to be desired, or they might have an issue in their structure that the communication doesn't necessarily come through, and we find different standards. So what we do, and we do find mixed results, as I think I may have already said, and those are the businesses that we're interested in. If a business is operating at the standard, they've got a known history, we don't need to over invest in quality assuring their work, but we still dip in to make sure the standards met. So we do this desktop process to make sure that the PAS 2035 processes, it tells the PAS 2035 story, is perhaps the way of describing that. If not, we ask a few questions. We might ask for some more documents, so we might call that a non-compliance. It's not a failure, it's just a non-compliance where we require some more information. And then depending on the nature and quality of the lodgements that we find, we then direct our team of surveyors onto site to physically go and have a look at the work to make sure that what's said has been delivered has actually been delivered, and it's been delivered at the right quality. And that's something that's grown as the delivery of the schemes ramps up. So accordingly, our ability to be able to increase our quality assurance function grows, and our team of surveyors continues to expand. When I go into the office, there's more and more of these. Generally, we probably need a little bit more of diversity, but more and more of these chaps in the team start to grow. And that's really interesting and encouraging to see. And I believe, if you've got any questions Trustmark related, I know it says eco at Trustmark, but if you email that address, it's across all schemes. It's a generic mailbox that we have, and there's some other links there into social housing retrofit and into the social housing decarbonisation accelerator email addresses. So it might be a comment, it might be a question that you have for them, or it might be a question that you have for Trustmark. Thank you for listening.